year when we come to this gospel. And the gospel surprises us in so many ways by the very criteria in which Christ judges. It tells us that Christ gathers up the people of all nations. It doesn't talk about Israel, about Jews or Gentiles, about Greeks, but the fact that Christ takes all people from all over the world. And when he comes to look, and when he comes to judge, and when he comes to find goodness and love and compassion, this gospel implies that he finds that amongst all of these nations. Why else would it say in this very, very clearly that he gathered all nations? And when he separates one from another, he doesn't do this according to circumcision or baptism or criteria that are stated. He does it according to the criteria that are laid down in this gospel. He doesn't even come and check creed and belief. It's not to say that what we believe isn't important, but the thing that comes first in this gospel is love, is compassion, and is humanity. Come, ye blessed of my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And you know, he gives this list. He gives this list in which he speaks of his own hunger, of his own thirst, of his own dislocation. I was a stranger. If you like, his refugee status. He speaks of this. He speaks of being naked and cold. He speaks of being sick. He speaks of being captive and in prison. All of these things Christ uses as examples for those who are in misery, for those who are in need, and for those who need just the touch of human kindness and love. This is the criteria by which Christ judges the sheep and the goats here. We know what comes next, that the writers say, well, we can't remember doing any of these things for you, Lord. When did we do them? And of course, he goes through this, all of these criteria of people, and he says very powerfully for us that he shall say, inasmuch you've done it for the brethren, you have done it for me. Done what? Done all of the things in the list. To have cared, to have fed the hungry, to have clothed the naked, to have visited the prisoners, to have visited and to console the sick. That they, as we've said so many times, become the medium by which we actually show our love to Christ himself. This gospel, of course, speaks in that symbolic language of the sheep and the goats. That the sheep are those who will be set at the right side. That the sheep are those who do all of these things. That show compassion and love and mercy. And do all of the things which we consider to be the message of the Christian gospel. The goats, well, they are the ones who are like goats. Goats are creatures of which I'm very fond. But goats, as we know, are extremely willful. Goats have attitude. Goats do things their way, including eating your beard and your hair and the contents of your pockets. Goats don't do what the sheep do. The sheep who come to the shepherd, who know the shepherd. When we look around, we think we know very often who the sheep and the goats are in human terms. We look around. We're told not to judge, but we have judged. And perhaps we've looked and we've thought, do you know what? Is that person a sheep or a goat? They would definitely be a sheep. That person's definitely a goat. My goodness, in the unfolding of this gospel and the realization of this gospel, we are probably going to discover and find that we had got it wrong. Who are the sheep? Are the people who pray a lot, who are very pious, who are essentially good people, who keep the commandments? Do you remember the rich young man? What, Lord, must I do to obtain everlasting life? And that Christ goes through all of the Mosaic law summed up. And he says, but I've kept all of these things. Well, we know that there was something lacking in his life. We can do all sorts of wonderful things, and there can be great holes in our life. And we think we're the sheep. And then we're going to have that surprise when it turns out at last minute that we discovered that we've had mistaken identity. That in spiritual terms, we've actually had some sort of species dysphoria. We're not sheep as we thought. We are goats. And why? Because we have failed to live up to this fundamental challenge of the gospel. To love, to show compassion. Perhaps we think we're sheep because we say, but I've loved, I've shown compassion. Yes, we may have done that, but to whom? To whom have we shown love and compassion? Have we shown it to the people that we like? To the people whom we choose to be our neighbour? The people who have the same interests as us? The people in our family who are our loved ones, our own? The people whom we associate with and with whom we identify? It's very easy to be loving and generous to these people. By this gospel, Christ challenges us, actually, because do you know what? Some of these people that we need to comfort in sickness and imprisonment and to feed them and to clothe them, as we said before, they're not people that we would choose to spend our lives with. They're people with horrible habits. They are people who are unsociable. They are people who are ugly in some way in their life. And Christ says to us, tough luck. You cannot choose who your neighbour is. Your neighbour is every person that surrounds you. And your neighbour is created in the image and likeness of God. And the challenge of this gospel is for us to see our neighbour for whom we should be doing all of these things. In the people who are hardest in our lives. The people whom nobody wants. St. John of Kronstadt did not go out and look for the people who were like him. He went out and he searched. And he found alcoholics. He found drug addicts. He found prostitutes. He found people of obnoxious living habits. And he showed them love and compassion. Because he looked for the image of Christ in them. And others will have done the same thing. Mother Maria, St. Maria of Paris, in the queue to go into the gas chamber in Ravensbrück. I bet this was happening. That she was looking and she was seeing the icon of Christ and the image of God, even in those who were herding her and women and children to their death. The Holy Royal Martyrs in Tobolsk, in Yekaterinburg. Read the diaries. Read the diaries of the imperial family. And in that you will see their interest, their warmth, their compassion for the poor souls who looked after them. And they talked to them. And, of course, the Soviets were frightened because, of course, those who were on the receiving end of this humanity started to respond to this humanity and this human warmth. They looked for the image of Christ, of God, in their persecutors. Think of the Grand Duchess Elizabeth on that bridge, collecting her husband's flesh and putting it in a box. Fingers, bits of his body that had been blown to bits by a terrorist. she went and collected these bloodied remains of the Grand Duke Sergei. And what did she do? She went to the prison and she went to see the man who had thrown the bomb that had killed the love of her life and her devoted husband. Why? Because he was her neighbour. He'd done this great atrocity, and yet he remained her neighbour, in which she had, for the gospel's sake, to go and look for Christ in him. And we can go through the lives and sufferings of so many of the martyrs and the saints in the last century. St. John of Riga, crucified in his own cathedral and nailed up in the lower cathedral, and no doubt still trying to look for humanity and to look for Christ and to look for the image of God in those who did these terrible and awful things to him. Those sorts of people are included in this criterion of those to whom we must look as our neighbour and to show them mercy and love and compassion. And we know that it does touch people's hearts. But whether it touches their hearts or not, whether it changes them or not, it is an absolute command from Christ. Don't go and pick and choose. Don't go and decide who is worthy of your help, of your time, of your love, of your compassion. Don't do it. The criteria is an open list. You're just told to do these things, to have love, to have compassion, to have mercy, even if that person is very far from anything that makes you comfortable or peaceful. It's by that we become sheep. As we've said, how many of us will be goats? And will be goats who are deluded because we have convinced ourselves that we live up to this gospel. And yet, by our selectivity, by going there and not there, by liking him or her but not him or her, we fool ourselves and kid ourselves. This is a wake-up call in this gospel. A wake-up call to imitate the lavish and dangerous love of God, because it is lavish and it is dangerous. Christ, who we see in the prodigal son as the father who goes out to look for the lost, who is already out and looking. Christ who goes out and does that. Christ who scatters and throws his love, even if it will be trampled underfoot, even if it will be thrown back in his face. In not so many weeks, after post has passed with alarming speed, we will look upon the man of sorrows, and we will contemplate the cross, the nails, the spear, the prods, the pokes, the punches, the slaps, the spitting. And yet in those who slapped, who jeered, who pushed, who whipped, who hammered, Christ still looked as a human being, because he is human as well as God. And he looked at the humanity of those around them, and he expressed it. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. This was Christ, trying to cover humanity with forgiveness and with love and with mercy. And that's what this gospel is telling us to do as we prepare for the season of the great fast. To be merciful, and to be loving, and to be lavish, and to be daring. To dare to love the unlovable, to like the unlikable, to mix with those, perhaps, depending on our circumstances, or at least to support those who actually revile us, those who make us scared and frightened. And why? All in the name of the gospel of love with which Christ challenges us on this day. Because for the goats, we know of weeping and wailing, gnashing of teeth, of being cast out, of being thrown out. And why? Because the goats refused to love.
Amen.